everyone, and welcome back. I apologize for the slightly lower than previously expected quality of the stream today. I am actually on the road. I'm traveling, and so there's no one else to sort of get this whole streaming thing going, and so I'm going to run it myself this time. But I really wanted to be the one to talk to you about this topic that we're going to talk about today, second to last day of CodeLabs. And we're going to talk about pitching your project and yourself. And this is a topic that's really close to my heart. So why don't we just sort of get into it. Talk about especially why I called this pitching your project and yourself, not just your project. So why do we even bother with having this as part of CodeLabs, as part of why is this pitching process part of it? And the answer is something that I hated when I was in high school, and I completely understand if you hate as well. You are very much in good company. I know a lot of people who hated this when they were in high school, but all of us think it's really important now. So I guess, the sort of saying is like, do as I say, not as I do. I totally understand if you don't get the benefit of this yet, but at some point you will, and hopefully it's a good skill that you will have picked up by then, which is networking. We're not talking about computer networking here. What we're talking about is learning to learning to talk to people in order to get jobs, in order to get internships, in order to get many different, sort of interpersonal benefits that objectively, yeah, like you should just be judged based on the quality of your work. But that's unfortunately not always the way that the world works in practice. And a lot of it is about, who you know. And so especially if, for example, you want to get something like an internship when you're in high school, or even when you're going into the workforce, it's often really important to be comfortable meeting people and to be comfortable having conversations about them where you sort of talk about how cool you are and what sort of cool projects you've done. And so to give you a real world example of this, an example from some of the early code days that we hosted was that one of our code day students was a high school dropout. He was working doing sort of video game testing, but that's not necessarily a super well-paying or very technically in-depth job. It was for a contractor for a big company. It wasn't getting paid that well. He went to an event and just started talking with someone in line when he was waiting for food, and just sort of talking about the cool projects that he's made and what he was interested in and his thoughts on programming language and the other guy's thoughts on programming languages. And it turned out that the guy was the CTO of a several hundred person company, and he basically said, we will find a way to get you a job. And this student of ours, it was sort of the big break for him, and he's now quite successful. So being able to talk sort of coherently about what it is that you do is a really good skill for you to build up, and it's something that doesn't come as naturally to most people as you might think. You might think you see people and you're like, oh man, these guys can do this, I can't. That's game over. But it is one of those things that you learn over time. And it's one of those things that took me a while, even as someone who regularly gets up on stage and talks to people. So why we have this as part of CodeLabs is, as simple as we want to give you some practice doing it. So CodeLabs is almost over. Demo day is Friday. Just to get this out of the way first, because I think this is one of the questions that's on a lot of people's minds, is how is this going to work operationally? So we had planned to do a live stream tomorrow where everyone could sort of call in live and demonstrate what it is that they made. A lot of people had emailed or had heard through their mentors saying that they couldn't make the time that we had scheduled, and was there another way for them to participate? Given that this is a problem for a lot of people, we decided, okay, we won't do this live. It's not as much fun. But what we will do instead is we'll have you submit a video of what it is that you made. And what you'll want to do is do a screen share recording. Now, if you don't know how to do this, Mac and even Windows now, I believe, have tools built in that will allow you to record the screen. There's also freely available tools online that make it pretty easy for you to do. If you have an app, you can record an emulator, you can record a screen share, or you can just hold it up to a webcam if you have a webcam as well. But we're going to have you basically record your own screen, and then you will submit that, and we will sort of put together a, like a web page that shows all the cool projects that you all made. And this is actually great too, because we can send this on to some of our sponsors who are often hiring interns, and we can say, check out these cool projects. If you want to get in touch with any of these students, let us know. So operationally, what you need to do is record your screen and then submit it. and we'll talk about how to submit it at the end of this. And that's kind of how that's going to go. Now, the real question again, and this is the topic of this workshop, is what should be in your presentation? So what we want is what's called an elevator pitch. And the idea of an elevator pitch comes from this concept, which is if you were in an elevator with someone important, how would you describe what you made? And remember, elevators usually don't last 5, 6, 7 minutes. So you really need to be pretty quick. Now, is an elevator pitch something that could really happen in real life? Yes and no. I mean, how often are you in an elevator with someone really important? Maybe elevator is not the right example. So for an example, with my last company that I was working on, it was a tech startup backed by Y Combinator and a bunch of investors. We were getting coffee at a coffee place in Palo Alto, California, and right in front of us in the coffee line was a really, really, really famous investor who had spilled coffee on himself. And we sort of got to talking with him, and he wanted to know what it is that we made. And that ended up turning into a meeting with them. They had previously invested in a similar company that the investment didn't really pay off for them, but they still really were interested in what the sort of thing that we were doing. So having this sort of elevator pitch, even though we weren't literally in the elevator, but having this, this really brief pitch that would work just as well if we're standing in line at a coffee shop, was really, really effective for us. And it's one of those things, again, where the example that I gave you at the beginning of someone standing in line to get food at a tech meetup, it's really, really helpful to have this brief explanation of what it is that you do. If you are, just happen to be meeting someone at a tech event or a conference, or even just someone who comes into your school, it's really cool, really beneficial to have this brief explanation of, projects that you've done in the past. So the concept of it being an elevator pitch, it doesn't literally need to be in an elevator. The concept is just make it a brief pitch. So with this pitch, I'm going to talk about what should go into it. But the first thing that I really want to clarify is that you do want to practice this. It is something that you want to have in your head. You need to have this memorized to some extent. At the same time, you want to think bullet points. You are not word for word reading from a script. So I just did a bad example on that last thing because I was word for word reading from the screen. That is not the point of practice in this case. What we don't want to do is have a word for word reading of what it is that we're going to do. We want to have the major points that we want to get across. So if you are not able to remember what it is that the general bullet points, if you're not able to remember those general bullet points and synthesize what it is that you're going to talk from that, there must be so much detail that the other person couldn't possibly remember it. Or alternatively, you're just being overly worried and you don't need to memorize every word for word, because that's not the point of conversations. The point is to convey information. So what we want to do is we want to get those bullet points. The two other benefits of that is that it's flexible. So if someone is going to interrupt you with a question, you want to be able to answer that question and then go back to your pitch without saying, oh, let me start over, I forgot what word I was on, which is not obviously something that anyone would ever do in the real world, but you don't want to sound flustered. So you want to practice those bullet points. The other benefit of that is that it can sound conversational. So because I'm not memorizing a script word for word, I'm able to sort of have a conversation with someone where someone feels like it's a two-way exchange. Because if you are memorizing things word for word, it often sounds scripted. And when it sounds scripted, people don't feel like they're talking with you. They feel like you're talking to them, which is not really something that people are interested in. So you want to practice, but it's okay if things change from point to point. What I would recommend is, as you're figuring out what you're going to say in your thing, I would recommend just write down maybe 5 to 10 bullet points that you want to get across. It could be even less if you wanted to. We'll talk at the end about something, a useful technique that I learned. But you want to remember a few bullet points and just make sure you touch on those bullet points. That are the really key things. And then the words that you say to touch on those don't matter as much. So what do we want to include in our elevator pitch? There's 3 major points. One, the very first thing that we want to do is we want to talk about why. People tend to like stories, and so it's really, really helpful to talk about why it is that you worked on this project. This is not necessarily universally the case. This is not universally the way that you need to structure it either, but this is a really helpful way that I've found to create a compelling, really brief pitch, and that is to turn it into a story. So the story has sort of like, the simplest story has sort of like two parts, the before and the after, and then we will add something else on at the end as well. But we have these two parts, and the first part is the before. So why did you make this? Now, if you attended any of the workshops last week, you might remember we talked about things like features versus benefits. We talked about things like customer development and design thinking and how we come up with projects and all sorts of different businessy reasons. If you have any of those reasons, this is the point to tell it. And if you were talking to an actual startup or an actual tech company or anyone like that, this is the point where you would start to, they would explain, oh, here's what we did. So, did you identify a need that people had? In my last tech company, the product that we started out building was for protesters. And so this is the point where I would talk about how we were watching some protests that were happening, and they had some video of it, but it was really, really hard to follow what was going on because people's phones would turn on and off, and people would leave, and they had a shot of their shoe. This is the point where I would talk about that sort of thing. This is the thing that caused it for us. Now, on the other hand, if you don't have that, if it's just because you're interested in something, just say that too. Like, hey, I really wanted to learn how to set up a web server in ASP.NET on Linux. Or hey, I just really wanted to learn Android development. I'd never done it before, but it seemed like a useful skill to have. It doesn't sound necessarily like super critical information, but it is one of those things where it helps people to remember sort of the entire thing if you phrase it as a story, and it helps them empathize with you and realize, what it is, why it is that you did this project. It sort of frames everything you're about to say. So start with the why. Why is it that you did this? The second thing is literally, what did you make? So what is it that you ultimately did? Why is it cool? And show people what it is that you made. And by the way, when I say here you can give a demo, I don't mean that the previous one should have been like a slide deck. I mean, like, the previous things really should have been, if you have like a start screen, talk over your start screen. This is the point where you actually start playing the thing. Don't make a slide deck. That is one of the things that you should not do, because if you were in an elevator or a coffee line or a line for food at a tech meetup, you're not going to have something to show your slide deck on. It's okay to have a presentation with a slide deck sometimes. This is not one of those times, not for an elevator pitch. If you happen to be working on a company and you're hoping that you're going to make money from the product that you're making in CodeLabs, sure, make a slide presentation too, but you still need to get people interested enough to actually watch that presentation. So this is the point where you actually demonstrate what it is that you do. Previously, it's okay, to just have the demo running as well, just to be clear. So what you want to talk about here is what you ultimately did, and why is it that what you made was really, really cool. And we'll touch on this again later, but you want to avoid going into like just super nitty-gritty details that no one cares about. So if there's something that you think is really interesting about, for example, the code, totally fine to show that off. Go into the code, make your font size a little bit bigger so people can read it. And show off how you learned about threads, and you can point out some examples where you did threads, or show where you learned about async and await, or just show your general class structure or something like that. If that's something that you think is really cool, go ahead and show it off. If there are features that you think are really cool that you were really excited to build, go ahead and show it off. On the other hand, if, for example, you did a password reset feature, and like this is, you have a bunch of stuff built out in your main app, but also you have the ability to create accounts, register for accounts, or sorry, create accounts, log into accounts, and reset passwords. Do you really need to show that? I mean, if that's the major thing that you built, sure. But is that really so cool to everyone else who's spent, at least 3 or 4 minutes of every single day logging into accounts? Probably not. So you don't necessarily need to show that. We'll talk about that again later. Get into really what is it that you ultimately made. Another thing that we're going to talk about later is the avoiding the trap of talking about what you didn't make. We will also talk about that again in a bit. So we got these two things right now. The sort of before stage, The after stage, right? The why did you want to make this? And, I made the thing. The third thing that we want to talk about is you. So we talked about briefly why it is that you want to make this, but you can elaborate on this a little bit more. Like, I've always, been learning programming through my school. I've only ever done Java, and so I always wanted to learn a different programming language. That would be an example of something that you could talk about here. Um, people are interested to learn a little bit more about you, basically. Why are you the one to solve this problem? What skills and qualifications do you have? I know that most of you are in high school. That is the target audience for CodeLabs. A few of you, I think, are even in middle school, but everyone here has some qualification. At the very least, and I think Nicholas talked about this in his presentation on Monday about how to get an internship or a job in technology, you have the qualification of being young, which sounds like it could be a negative. In many cases, when you're, talking to people, the fact that you're young is a negative. There are lots of things you can't do, but there's one thing you can do, which is relate to other young people. And lots of people who work, especially in technology, are sort of envious of that fact. A lot of times they want to build products that appeal to younger people, and they don't understand, younger people. I, as someone who is 28, have difficulty at some points understanding high school students, even as someone who spends a lot of time around high school students, just because, I'm not a high school student anymore. So at the very least, that's a qualification that you have, but there are probably others as well. Even if you are in high school and don't have as much experience, you might have played a lot more of this type of game that you made, or have more domain experience in the type of app, the type of problem that the app that you made solves than most random people on the street would. Why do you want to talk about these things? Again, it's because people believe in people. So you're not trying to pitch this just to tell people literally what it is that you did. If you were at the workshop on, I believe, last Wednesday or Thursday with Cameron Borman of Ignition Venture Partners, he was talking a lot about how most of his job is meeting people who are talented and staying in touch with them. And then when they do something, sort of meeting with them again and learning more about what it is that they do. At the end of the day, if you're getting a job, if you are starting a tech company, or even if you're doing something completely unrelated to technology, people are not just believing in what it is that you've done in the past. They want to know more about you and know more about the sort of things that you can do in the future. And so telling them about yourself is a really critical part to pitching anything. And this is one of those things that you want to do. At the same time, I usually like to leave it until the end, because I think it's a little bit more exciting at the end. Once people are already excited about the idea, to talk a little bit more about yourself, because then they're a little bit more bought in. So those are the three things that should be in your pitch. Why did you make this thing? What is it that you made in the end? You can, kind of blurs together. Like, you're probably at the very beginning going to say, this is, a presentation about X. Let me start off by telling you about why I made this thing, so on and so forth. Second thing, again, is going to be what it is that you actually made. And the third thing is going to be just tell them a little bit about yourself. So as an example, really briefly, to talk about SR&D, I might say something like, hey, I'm here to talk to you about SR&D. We are a nonprofit, and the problem that we're really set out to solve is that there are a lot of students who are already in high schools who aren't interested in taking computer science classes because they think, I could never program, it's not something I could ever do. So we decided to make some events that target people who have no interest in programming or very little interest in programming already, help them make cool things on their own, and get them excited about computer science. And one of the things about that is an event called Code Day. It's a 24-hour programming event where students make apps or games. They need no experience when they're coming in with it. We have mentors and introductory workshops, but then by the end of it, these total beginners have made something really cool. And just so you know a little bit more about me, I'm really interested in this because I just randomly found programming because when I was in elementary school, or in middle school, I think, I found a book that taught me how to make a cool thing in a programming language called Visual Basic, and it had a cool picture on the front. And that's the only reason I ever got interested in technology. And so I don't want other people to have that luck. I want to bring them an event that just gets them interested in technology as well. My background is that I used to run a tech startup, and I worked at Microsoft Research, so I have some experience on both sides of the problem. There we go. that is an example of putting those three pieces together. So I hope that that gives you a good example of what this could look like. I want to talk next just about some things that are sort of pro tips on things you can do, and then things you shouldn't do. And then finally, at the end of this, we're going to get to how to actually submit your presentation. So here are some pro tips. The first one, this is something that everyone I know struggles with. I struggle with it myself. This is more true when you're up on stage than in recordings, because recordings you usually have a little bit better microphone quality than echoey large theaters, but it's still true either way. You want to speak unnaturally, slowly. And very specifically, the thing that I was told, and I was told this by a very well-known, famous person at the time, very well respected in the sort of tech and investment community, Paul Graham. If it doesn't feel unnatural, you're speaking too fast. Even with this presentation, which I think I'm still probably speaking slightly too fast, the speed at which I speak is unnaturally slow for me. It just feels really, really slow. That is one of those things to keep in mind. Remind yourself to slow down. I've seen people even write on their hand, slow. And so when they look at it, at least they remember, oh, I need to slow down. And so it kind of speeds up and it slows down and it speeds up and it slows down. But if that works for you, go for it. Another thing that is a good pro tip, you don't have to use this, but I think is helpful, is another thing I learned from Paul Graham, actually, is a thing called one thing and three things. I don't think he ever called it that, but this is the way he put it to us, is that if everyone who watches your video or your presentation or hears you talk is going to remember, if they really like you, three things. And if they don't like you, at the very least, they'll remember one thing for a little bit of time, right? If they don't care at all, they'll probably still at least remember one thing. So what is that one thing for you that everyone should remember? And then what are the other two things, that combine to make three, the other two things that people who really do like you should remember? So, for example, if I were making an app, the one thing that someone should remember is probably the most very basic, literally, what does the app do? This is an app to track my bicycle path, right? It's probably the one thing. What are the other two things? You could very much condense your entire presentation down to just focusing on going back to that one thing or those three things. So it's a good framework to avoid adding too much detail that no one is ever going to remember. Try to shape, everyone has a limited memory, shape what it is they're going to remember. The last pro tip that I have for you is to really conclude with a call to action. If you want an internship, say, visit my webpage to learn more about me, or send me an email here if you are interested in working with me. That can be your call to action. If you just want people to download your app, tell them to go download your app. Figure out what it is that you want people to do next. Make that the very last thing you say, other than maybe thank you. And then hopefully they'll do it. And this is true of many things, by the way. When you're writing an email, it's also helpful to have the very last sentence, very last paragraph even, just be, here's what I want you to do next, basically. So if you would love to get an internship or something, you can literally say that in your video. I'm giving you permission right now to ask people to email you if they have internships available. Pro tips on things to avoid. I mentioned this earlier. I mentioned a few of these earlier. Don't show every feature. So again, you really don't want to show, if someone can change their name and phone number from different screens, do you really need to show both of them, right? Do you really need to show that logout works? I know that you built it. It's great that you built it, but everyone else is just going to believe that it works whether or not it actually does, which is kind of like what I'd call like a dark pattern, right? Is like you can kind of deceive people by putting things on the screen, because most of us are just going to trust that if there's a logout button, you show it in your thing, it's going to work. Consequently, you don't actually need to show us the logout button working unless it's a really key feature of your app. Really focus on the major things that make it really cool, because you don't have that much time. Sounding really monotone or over-rehearsed is another one. That's why I really encourage you to try to stick to those bullet points. Every single pitch should be slightly different. not because it's good for it to be slightly different, just because it shows that you're having a conversation with someone. You're not just reciting a speech. And even in fact, when I have given speeches, I still tend to deviate slightly from every single rehearsal, because it's not critical that I say every word for word, unless you're a politician. What is critical is that you cover the major points. The opposite of the speaking very slowly is speaking really fast. And this is a really common thing that people do, is they speak so fast and people can't understand what they're saying, and then no one has any idea what is even coming out, and what the screen is about, and don't want to do that. You want to speak slowly enough that people can actually understand you, because if you're speaking too fast, then no one is going to know what you made. So if you need to, write it down on a sticky note, stick it on your screen, speak slowly. The last thing, this is not strictly speaking necessary in CodeLabs, but it's a good thing to try to keep in mind. Don't use too many technical terms. Some technical terms are totally fine and are generally more understood. So things like classes, functions, method call, array list, hash map, those sort of things. Generally, people will understand what they mean, or have at least encountered them. Some things are more in the border, so things like threads, some people might understand it, some people won't. It depends on your audience. So in this case, we're talking more to newer programmers who are going through CodeLabs. Might be good to avoid it. On the other hand, if you're mostly making this because you're hoping that you're going to get an internship in the future, totally fair to talk about threading. On the other hand, for example, I would probably not talk about monads. If you even know what a monad is, awesome. But most people don't. Again, unless you're really, really targeting, I'm making this video because I want to get an internship, in which case, sure, throw in all the technical terms that you want. In general, it's good to avoid that, because a lot of people won't really understand what you're saying if you get too heavy into the jargon. Okay, so at the very end of this presentation, so now the how-to section, how are you going to submit this? We are going to email you a link where you can submit your video tomorrow. Or alternatively, you can send a video to codelabs@srnd.org if you have any problems with that. Or you can send it to us on chat. Just send it to either me personally, or post it in the town square chat room, and we'll correlate it there. But that's basically how you're going to get the information to us. And then once we have it, we will put it together in a web page and send it out to everyone so that everyone can see what everyone else made. So with that in mind, that's it for this workshop. Thank you all so much for coming, and I really can't wait to see what it is that you made over these past 2 weeks. And I can't wait for you to have this really cool tool for you to show potential future employers, or even just friends and family, hey, this is this cool thing I did with my summer. So again, thank you all so much for participating in CodeLabs, and we're really excited to see what it is that you made. Thank you.